So it's good to have everybody join us for what's a really important session on growing government revenues, supported by our friends at Simon Kucher and Partners. Two of whom are with us for the panel, which is great to have their expertise involved. So there's quite a lot to get through here, because the good news is that there's a lot that can be done to support local and central government through pricing and thinking about revenues in different ways. But I guess if we're going to start with the reality of where we are now in 2020, clearly revenue has taken a hit, like revenue in any sector. So it would be unfair of me to sort of ask somebody to sum up what's happened in about a minute. But David, I'm going to do just that for you. Perhaps you could give the audience a quick sort of indicator of what you're seeing in terms of the organisations, public sector, central and local government. What's happened to their revenues in 2020?
Yeah, and let's debunk a couple of myths along the way, because I think there's a big mindset thing. And thanks, James and Ros, your presentation. It was lovely to see somebody focusing on practical stuff people can do, which is really, really important around this. In public sector overall, COVID, I think, has brought into sharper focus the reality about central versus local funding. There is still a big issue around how public sector pays and gets its money, and it sort of throughout the whole public sector ethos was still very, very heavily driven by tax collection and how we make best use of taxation to then deliver services, when in reality a considerable portion of what we actually get comes through from revenue generation, more than we think at times. So taking first of all the overall public sector piece, the DWPs, the HMRCs of the world, they do their business. One collects all the taxes, the other one pays out, and that's fairly straightforward. Not a whole heap of stuff you can do around that, but in health and social care, I think the dynamics shift significantly. One fact out there: adult social care is 2/3 self-funded, 1/3 state-funded, and that's on a north of £60 billion a year entity. So think about that. That's 2/3 of the money going into that. Is coming from people's own pockets, but public sector influences heavily how that is used. And handles a lot of that. So also, when you look at local government has for the last 15 years been losing revenue support grant, the central government contribution, steadily. And the target was always to get to 100% local funding, no more central government funding. The two big levers around that, of course, have been business rates, oh dear, and council tax, kind of slightly less, oh dear. There are a lot more people now getting benefit around council tax. So those levers were the drivers around that decentralisation piece, but they're clearly under serious pressure. However, a lot of local authorities are only relying on about 50 to 60% of their revenue streams off those sources. Most of them, many, are actually drawing their revenues in from commercial investments, from other forms of collection. Rent collection is still significant. A lot of local authorities have taken housing back in from where they were arm's length organisations. That's not a trivial revenue stream and absolutely plays into the pricing strategy. And of course, the supply chain that flows down through that stuff as well. Everything from, repairs and maintenance, plumbing, and all of the other commercial activities, broadband, that flow down through that, creates lots of opportunity around there. The other element, of course, I think directly impacted around COVID has been, right, how is the balance of this stuff going to shift around redefining high streets? Now, my own view around that, around COVID, it's accelerated the inevitable. We knew it was happening with digital, and now what we're seeing is a recognition that we're going to have to move quicker on reshaping high streets as revenue generation opportunities to provide better places for people to live and work. And that's what local government's really about. It's about that improving prosperity, improving where we live, and improving people's life chances and keeping people safe. The final bit I want to pick up on this, which will be great hopefully for picking up yourself, James and Ros, is an ongoing frustration of mine in local government, and happens all the time, is the presumption we can't price because statutorily we're told we can't. Utter rubbish. depends on the intervention and it depends on your style. The example I'll just land with you and then hand over to James and Ros on this: planning. Now, my experience as exec director of Place, I had a very successful traded vehicle called Place Services, where we learned a long time ago to move planning from statutory to pre-app, yeah, which is consultation before you enter the formal process. Now, developers like that because it means they can have grown-up conversations before they're locked into a process. Public sector are not constrained on the charging model. That is a full-on commercial offer, which means you're able to position and price and offer service that people are really, and organizations really want, yeah, because you're not constrained by a statutory process that then tells you how much you can charge for the different elements that you go through. So thinking about where's the best point to intervene is critical to this. Yeah, and actually it's not bad to make profit, to actually invest into those services to improve the overall return and result that comes out. And that very final point on that is, and I loved what you said in your presentations again, profit isn't evil. In public sector, profit is a means by which we can suppress the need to raise taxation, right? Think of it in that way, because that's kind of how it works. That's how the balance works on the scales. Yeah.
David, thanks for
with that. Over to you guys.
Yeah, I mean that's a brilliant overview, and it's great to unpack the detail, because it would be easy to just sort of look at the big picture and say, you know, doom and gloom. But clearly there are lots of levers and there are lots of elements of a public sector portfolio that are still up for grabs and can be controlled and can be altered to generate revenue. So we are where we are in 2020, but if we're looking at sort of moving forwards, fighting back, however we want to sort of term it, I guess what are the things that local government in particular can do in response to this financial hit? Are there particular areas that you, perhaps James, would see as being where they should start, and do they need sort of greater flexibilities to be pulling some of those levers that David's outlined there?
I think, yeah, thanks Tim, thanks David. I think, David, you hit upon one key thing there. If you can transfer the service to something that people want to pay for, if you're offering something that people want to pay for, or a better service people want to pay more for, without prohibiting access from people who need it, you've hit upon the key thing within pricing there, differentiating, smart differentiating, which lets people choose to pay for things that they want. Always better than charging a tax on, just taking a tax from them. Now, Tim, you asked there about the greater flexibilities. I believe that actually local authorities have a huge amount of flexibility already. And as David said, there's a mindset there that stops them using it. We need to look harder at what can be done. So if it's a statutory service that we have to provide, we can't charge for it. If we can move something into discretionary, we're able to charge for it, but we're not able to make money on it, where it can only cover costs. And this mindset becomes a bit of a challenge, because we have to think of revenue and cost as two different pots. What it costs to provide service, you don't then decide what you're going to charge for it just by adding up the individual elements and saying, right, that cost me £200 to look at that application. I'm going to charge 220 because I need a 10% margin. You have to think of it as two different things. There's a tendency to lump everything together and focus on the cost recovery side of things. We can charge for services where we have a power, but not a duty to provide it. The reality is it becomes a guessing game about what we're going to charge, because if we don't want to overshoot on cost recovery, we go slightly lower. And then we get nervous that we might make some profit on it, because again, we think of profit as being this evil thing rather than a substitute for or alternative to taxation. And there is flex as well in how we can do this. So in the official advice way back in 2003, that the line was included, authorities are free to decide what methodology they wish to adopt for determining the cost of the services, how you're going to decide what goes in there, how you load that cost up to ensure you're recovering the right elements. So that's key. So we've got those things there. It's also acceptable to differentiate, by the way, within that. So we've got a lot of flexibility. Again, quoting from the guidance, charges may be set differently so that different people are charged different amounts. So you're not required to charge people for things just because you set a charge on it. So there's a lot of flexibility there But more interestingly, since 2011, we've seen the real increase, of course, in the local authority trading companies. And David, please correct me if I'm getting my numbers wrong, but I think something like 60% of local authorities have a trading company. And these are companies which are set up with the explicit aim of being able to generate efficiencies and make profit. And that's key. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Yeah. The other thing that we should look at more as well is assets, making money out of assets that we own. So there's a massive trend in the global economy towards renting, temporary use rather than ownership. Subscription economy. Think of, we jump into an Uber, we borrow bikes, we don't pay, we don't own, we tend to subscribe and pay for one-off uses. And way back in 2003, there was an example given by the Office of the Deputy Prime Minister about local authorities being innovative and loaning their art collections to local businesses and residents. Now, I'd love to think that local authorities out there are sitting on massive, untapped, highly valuable art collections. I don't think that's really going to be the case very often, but there are assets that aren't used all the time. And we've got the flexibility to charge for them, from property to experts to IT equipment, things that aren't used. So let's get creative because the flexibility is there.
Good stuff. And so it sounds like there is scope, there are opportunities, that there aren't these constraints possibly that people perceive externally. So where to start in terms of pricing? Maybe Ros, you could come to this one. What for the public sector organisation, what does a good pricing strategy look like? And then I guess as a follow-up to that, how many organisations are enacting one? Are they good at this stuff right now, and where's the scope for improvement?
Great. That's quite a big question, because obviously there's a lot of different elements, different areas being looked at. We've covered areas looking at rent, looking at planning, and you look at things like leisure as well, and different areas that different authorities may be involved in. The first off, really, let's take this back here. We've already discussed this a couple of times throughout the presentation. Was this pricing strategy is not just increasing prices, right? This is both the what you charge for, how you charge for it, and then what level you charge. Yes, if the level is wrong, that is a problem, but at the same time, those other two elements are really key. Also looking into that question, you say, okay, well, is my pricing strategy growth, or do I have other strategies or aims as well? And for some of those, that might be fairness, that might be supporting certain groups of citizens, etc., and ensuring they have access. And that becomes that strategy. Now, growing from that may become a secondary purpose, but definitely even within those bounds, they'll be more successful and growth supporting strategies than in others. And it's also, at the core, first, you need to understand who you're charging to and which groups are out there, because even within that, that's really different, right? And your strategy for growth, when you are charging to businesses who are then going to proceed to make a profit in themselves off of that, that's a very different strategy to if you're charging to someone in the lowest income bands who's struggling to pay for the standard services, etc. So really, first of all, I can't give you the perfect strategy for everything, but to say, who am I addressing? What are the differences within those groups? What is the value they place on this? In that B2B context, okay, well, or in this government to business context, who's going to make what profits from this? Because that will be quite different. And what is the end benefit of that to the local citizens as well, and start to look into those questions. And for growth, also just thinking that the obvious transactional approach may not be the best for growth. We see things like subscriptions were mentioned, and even taking that to a very simple example as I was presented just now, you look at things like bus journeys, etc. You could do an A to B. That seems the fairest, it's the lowest price. But actually then look at larger investments, weekly tickets, monthly tickets, and actually systematically you see the benefit that the citizens who have those in terms of increasing their journeys and actually providing greater interaction with the wider world. And actually that element actually becomes a much bigger value, and it locks in value, and it maintains a revenue stream. So it's not just necessarily the lowest price point and the simplest way of charging is the thing that supports growth, but really you've got to break it down to those individual consumers, businesses, or the citizens, and really address what they need. So unfortunately, I can't give the magic answer to the one pricing strategy.
Or we might be able to download it at the end, but no, of course, it's an incredibly sort of complex world. I mean, David, you've been on the inside of this. Ros is talking about sort of taking a quite strategic approach of looking at what your outcomes are intended to be, and the multiple sort of audiences and different types of product and portfolio. What's your experience been on the inside in terms of whether organisations have been good at setting those goals and defining the strategy that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think James, if anything, there's more local authorities now with trading companies. There's an interesting iceberg angle on this, which is LATC's local authority trading companies that are out there that are set up as entities that pay corporation tax. There's a whole bunch of those, but there's a whole raft of trading entities that are still within the authority and therefore they don't pay corporation tax. And they'll tell you it's a massive factor to consider when you move a commercial vehicle from within the council to outside the council, because that's your immediate trigger is say hello to corporation tax, add 20% on, bang. It can be the right answer, and it often is, but actually your start point is your 20% up before you move it anywhere. Yeah, and it's that kind of simplistic thinking on the fixed cost, which was really good to see in your presentation, is there. I think your bit, Rosalind, about that, be really, really clear about which market and what works best in which market. It's also important, because local government does G to C, government to citizen, does G to B, government to business, and it does G to P, government to public sector. There's a lot of that. So you've got three quite different markets that behave in very different ways, and there are very different ethics around each of those that need to be considered. And ethics is probably the biggest minefield for local government, perceived, but in reality actually not as difficult as people think. And so thinking about those in those kind of segments and understanding the drivers that are quite discrete around each of those is critical. And then thinking about respectively the ethics within those areas, I think gives you much more flexibility than thinking of it as a homogenous thing that's kind of a vertical that you just do the kind of the pure fixed and variable cost piece. So there's those kind of plays. From being on the inside, I was very fortunate to run a load of trading entities in Essex, and we had a mix of external, traded vehicles, wholly external, to a whole bunch that were internal, and some flavours in between. And our focus around those three elements, about being clear about what our market was, about what the ethics around them were, and actually, again, the other thing I really liked from both of yours, James, Rosalind, was that bronze, silver, gold thinking. Around how you're pricing. It's not wrong to offer a higher quality service if there's a market prepared to pay, and pre-app actually in planning is a brilliant example of that. Yeah, and even in social care, which is the one people get most nervous about, but is the biggest spend area in local government by a mile. There are, back to my earlier point, 2/3 of that market is self-funded. There is absolute merit in providing bronze, silver and gold services through those markets. It gets uncomfortable for people to think about that way, but actually, if it's people's own money making their own decisions, why shouldn't local government help to provide the best value proposition and generate revenues that help those that are most vulnerable?
It's interesting that the idea of balancing the portfolio, balancing perception, balancing sort of internal viewpoints as well. I'm interested to hear a bit more about this idea of ethics versus profit. Not that the two need to be in conflict, but the example you gave in the presentation about the university leadership team, where they couldn't even agree what the kind of best outcome would be for a program of change, whether it was increased volume of students through the university or increasing revenue, and how they could kind of balance that internal struggle. So I guess the question is, how can public sector leaders work towards this kind of ethical balance where the profits of public service are delivering the value to the community they need, but also delivering the revenue that they need to keep functioning? Clearly, let's say a commercial refuse tip doesn't have the same level of public scrutiny as a community cafe for vulnerable people. So there are not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but what might the approach be in order to start to work through this kind of ethical struggle and cultural tension? I've thrown you another horrible one there, Roz, but have a stab at that one.
That was over to me. Yeah, again, a big question, and I'll try and put some different examples in, but obviously it's not a one size fits all. So do think of the context you're looking at. I mean, step one is you've got to believe this internally as well, right? And this is not just a public sector scrutiny piece, right? This happens in the private sector as well. And the easiest way to justify how you do something, the easiest way to say, look, this wasn't us, this is just what happened, is to go to cost plus, is to prorate and adjust costing out and say, well, this is fair. I mean, there's nothing fair at the end to people who can't afford that, of saying, I just evenly split this across everyone because then that's fair for all. It's not. So you've got to really go into the back and underworkings of the current pricing and the charging there and say, okay, well, what are we doing? What are we achieving? Who are we failing through this? And who is actually benefiting more than others? And is that really aligned with what we're going to look at? Now, if you start to break that down and create some core, sort of, we call them pricing principles, what would I accept and what wouldn't I? What are those no-go zones? And that university example gave one of those to say, first let's accept what the kind of the boundaries that you're willing to accept, and what outside of that is just not within what you want to achieve more widely. Now, once you start to pull that apart and start to look and say, is it fair that I've passed through X, Y, Z to this group of citizens, for example, you'll quite quickly see that actually it's, dare I say, even a slightly lazy approach to justifying fairness, because actually you're not really representing and capturing what people are willing to pay, what they're able to pay, and you might be undermining other really important strategic aims as well. And we see this across the board, right? It's trying to say, well, if I don't know exactly what people want to pay, the easiest way is to go to cost plus. So first, believe it internally, really scrutinize what you're trying to achieve and question, is this achieving this? And there will be unknowns. Costs are known. Willingness to pay, end users' views, etc., are a little bit less known, and they do come with public scrutiny, etc. So you've got to believe it. You've got to be able to justify it, not just I'm trying to make the biggest profit out of X, Y, Z possible. But the reality is the revenue needs to be raised for very good purposes, right? It is needed in other places. So looking for where there is opportunity, and if people can self-select in, so you say, I always maintain X service level if we went into the sort of care sector, that's a no-go decision, right? This is what everyone can get. However, we will do X, Y, Z and give X, Y, Z other options to those who can afford to move into that. But we're not going to, at the same time, you're not picking apart every single element of that. There's a core that you stand for and you will not go under. But at the same time, to support that and to be, let's be honest, to potentially make that on average better, we will allow others to pay for other elements of that. So yeah, you've got to believe it, you've got to be able to justify it, but within breaking that down and understanding, I think very quickly you can get to a point where, from ethics, and I'll say we won't judge other people's ethics on this matter, you can really justify it. But just putting prices up, etc., if internally people don't believe it, then yes, it's going to be hard to explain. But with any price change, with any sort of pricing structure change, be ready with the rationale for it, be ready with the numbers to justify it. Don't just hope that things are going to get implemented and then ignored or kind of just ignored by the media, etc. It probably won't, but be ready to explain it clearly. And if you're happy with that, if you understand that and it justifies, you've got that message to go out as well.
Great stuff. And James, I'm interested in this idea of change and how you make it happen, how you start to bring through, we know that there are some very smart commercial minds in the public sector, and this idea that it's not about that they need to think more commercially across the board. That's not the case. But where there are sort of issues or challenges just to move forward, whether it's the sort of speed of change or whether it's the direction of travel in terms of pricing and revenue, how can you, because you work with public and private sector, and I guess there are parallels and overlaps with both. How do you start to help organizations move forward in terms of having this more sort of not aggressive but more proactive approach to revenue, so that they can deliver the revenue in the areas where it's appropriate and possible, while safeguarding and protecting and ring fencing areas where there's clearly no desire and the previously mentioned cultural impact would be too great?
Yeah, and you're right. There are some incredibly smart commercial strategies being deployed out there, and we scoured, in preparing for this. We scoured hundreds of pricing and service charging lists and service definitions across the local government sector for England, just trying to see what people were doing. There's some amazing things out there, but there's still, as you say, there's this cultural legacy. There's the need to take a slightly more commercial outlook in some areas. And as David said at the start, first thing is getting over this idea that profit isn't a dirty word. It provides you with income to meet your obligations to your citizens and to improve your services. So that's one key thing. And the other, and this is something we've seen in public and private, is the advantages of having focused professionals with clear responsibility for pricing or revenue management. And that's increased dramatically over the last 10 years in a lot of the private sector. And I think we're going to start seeing it soon in some of the public sector areas where the revenue pools are big enough to justify. Giving someone that job title, that role, really helps concentrate the effort. If it's a sideline, if it's just someone's responsibility to make sure a price list is updated, or to make sure that the strategy has considered revenue models overall, it becomes a tick box exercise. But having someone focused on it can normally pay dividends, pay for itself pretty quickly as well. So pricing champions is a good start if you can't dedicate an individual to the role, so having someone to champion it. But actually longer term, look at, can you justify having a revenue management professional in role?
Good stuff. It sounds like you might be sitting on a treasure trove of insights based on your research of all the different sort of service models and pricing models. David, throw to you. Again, you've been on the inside of this. How have you seen change happening effectively? What have been the sort of triggers to get this moving in your organisations that you've been part of?
I think there's a couple of things. I mean, James has just touched on one, which is, you know, a recognition that getting somebody with full commercial knowledge and full commercial awareness is not your head of procurement. Right? And pricing is not running a procurement exercise. Absolutely not. And that I think would be fair to say that that's what you see all too often in public sector organisations. That's changing. It's been changing, I would say, over the last 10 years. But what we've seen is we've seen it on a silo basis. It's been around, let's get a commercial director in to focus on what assets we're going to buy to generate revenue, rather than let's get a commercial director in to look at the entire revenue base of our organisation and our population and what are our opportunities out there. They're fundamentally different things. Yeah. So that shift to that broader thing has happened in a few places where I've seen some good examples. Westminster had long standing, you know, had that kind of practice, no surprise. And the reason? Political leadership. Do you have political leadership that get commerciality? Yeah. And that, I think, is a key influencer in this. And I think there is more to come through, I think, around how that political leadership can shape the leadership, the executive leadership and the operational leadership of the organisation, to recognise those core principles we've already mentioned. You know, profit isn't evil. Let's look at what's the best way to resource the place and people we've been elected to represent. Yeah, and it's getting back to those kind of fundamentals. Again, I've seen that in some authorities. I still feel I see it in a lot of other authorities where that's still uncomfortable, which then gets you back into the ethics conversation. Yeah, and for me, they're the three legs of the stool. That's how you kind of got to work that through. So that acceptance that it's about, stop thinking about the type of money and thinking about the resource base to make the best of our place and people. Yeah, think about, right, how do we maximize what we have available to unlock that potential. Yeah, and actually, how do we do that in a fair way? Yeah, that recognizes we meet the needs of our most vulnerable. Yeah, whilst absolutely providing what others may want. Yeah, and it's those three components would play through. Best example I've seen in the last 5 years, and it's lovely to see it coming back in, is local authorities getting back into house building. But they're not getting into it for social housing necessarily. They're getting into it as part of it is impatience around what's happened in the market, and actually councils taking some of their capital funding and actually driving through commercial house building opportunities to generate income and capital turnover and revenue streams. Yeah. And it's good to see them getting back in that market, because what it's also doing is disrupting the commercial market, frankly giving it a kick up the arse, to kind of break out and actually bring some of that revenue back in. Let's see more. I'd love to see that in the social care space. I'd love to see that in the leisure space. I'd love to see that in the green asset space. where so many authorities are sitting on huge amounts of assets. You touched on it, James, not just art collections, but hundreds of acres of parkland. Yeah, get creative with it. We did in Essex. We managed to turn the country parks into profit centres, which then are invested back into those parks to make them even better. And we did it with things like having the Gruffalo Trail in one of the parks because the author lived down the road. You know, unlocking that potential, incredible.
So clearly, it's going to need a degree of creativity and sort of forward-looking approach from public sector organisations. And as we look forward into 2021, and we'll caveat this discussion with nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in terms of the economy reopening and people's freedom of movement and so on. But if some semblance of that returns, what are we returning to? I mean, are we ever going to be back to the sort of pre-2020 quotes normal in terms of a rates-based revenue system, the high street driving revenue, or are we going to go back to something different and the world will have to adapt accordingly? What do you think, James?
Do you want the 1 minute, the 5 minute, or the 2 hour answer?
Let's do the 2 minute.
Yeah. I'll give the 2-3 minute answer because that's coming up to time. But I think the world is not going to go back to how it was. I mean, the vaccine news is hugely positive. We're going to see some of the social restrictions ease within months because the heavy cost socially has been devastating. But we are going to get back to something that is far more like the way of life that we used to have. But when it comes, there are permanent changes that have happened. And if we take that rates example, so as David mentioned, it's been an acceleration of changes in the economy. The switch to digital. I mean, can you imagine 1 year ago saying that we were going to do this conference virtually? It just wouldn't have happened. People wouldn't have been able to come on as panelists virtually. Shopping has been the big thing. It's massively boosted the e-commerce. It's incredible. The UK was already a leader in this. The UK was already well ahead of many other countries in terms of the number of people who shopped online. But this has transformed things and pushed it even further. And that's not going to suddenly go back. Now, with that comes the fact that a big portion of local authority revenue came from rates. And of course, the high street was a huge contributor to that. But you've got lots of other things as well where the revenue generation and the profit generation of the body that's being taxed or charged rates is not going to be local anymore, because location doesn't matter so much for that delivery. At the same time, delivery of local government services is ever more local, and there needs to be ever more agile. I mean, kudos to my local authority, North Tyneside, where I live. What they've done is incredible. The agility they've had to change the way they're deploying resources to meet urgent needs during the pandemic has been amazing. And we're going to see, more local delivery of services, smarter things that are needed to be passed on. And so there will be a burden that falls on the local authority and the local decision makers who know the population in the area. That's going to be staying, will probably get stronger. But local generation of revenue from traditional things such as rates will get harder, which means we're going to have some kind of rebalance. And this becomes about revenue model. And this is hitting everything. If we look even longer term, central government, they're talking about road pricing now. Why? Because the mechanism and the way that they gather rates, gather charges for car tax is going to fundamentally change. So they go, right, let's have a complete revenue model change. We'll charge per mile driven. Whoa, hold on a minute. That massively transfers the burden from one set of people to another, and it causes all sorts of shifts. So whenever you have these changes that are needed in the way that we're living, the way that we're operating, needs to lead to a change in revenue model. And if we think specifically on the local government question, it's going to need to lead to a shift in the way that money is allocated from central to local and vice versa.
Great stuff. It sounds, there are clearly big changes coming, but there are clear opportunities as we head into 2021. So it's good to end on a sort of positive note, really, to think about how organizations can be more forward looking and can be trying new things. And if anything, the last 3 days have shown us, we've been hearing case studies about innovation and digital transformation, but if this revenue piece doesn't recover, then the funding isn't there to unlock the potential of all these other projects, all these great people that we have in the public sector. So hugely important subject, and it's good to hear some very practical examples of how it can be done, how to get started, how to drive the cultural change, how to manage external perceptions as well. It's a fascinating topic that draws in so many aspects of the way an organization performs and runs. And obviously, I'd say any organizations looking to sort of get accelerating this journey, I'm sure they can reach out to you, James and Ros and Simon Kucher, to sort of have a conversation, because if they need help along the way, that'll be a good place to start. So thanks everybody for your help and input. It's been a great conversation. We could probably do another 2 hours of this, given the way the world is, and given the number of levers to pull in sort of public sector revenue and commercial activities. But time has kind of drawn to a close, so I'll just say thank you to you all for joining us, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everyone.
Cheers then.
Bye bye.